You know, there are people who watch cute puppy videos or baby reels at night to soothe them to sleep. There are some people who get into bed with a big packet of Cheetos, blankets tight, and watch true crime documentaries before bed. We happen to fall into this second category. If you're someone like me who has questionable bedtime choices, buckle up because today's video is going to be mercilessly blood-soaked. Serial killers have come and gone over the decades, slashing people's throats, killing them in weird biblical patterns, and chopping them up into tiny pieces. They've tormented neighborhoods for months or even years, preying on unsuspecting victims and giving the police a run for their money. Nevertheless, law enforcement usually emerges victorious and manage to put many of the psychopaths behind bars. However, there are certain cases which still haunt investigating officers, killers who could never be identified or apprehended. They might have been this close to cracking the case, but those pesky bastards were always a step ahead. That's exactly what we're going to explore today. Unsolved cases that slip through the hands of justice, looming over our heads, faceless shadow. The Zodiac Killer, California, late 1960s. It's pretty obvious why this name is on the very top of our list, and if you caught Fincher's 2007 masterpiece, you definitely have some knowledge as to what a handful this person was. Based on some eyewitness accounts, we have a rough idea about how he looked. Presumably, he's a heavy white man, roughly 5'8", with curly brown hair. Some stated he wore glasses, while others couldn't clarify. The Zodiac Killer, as he's in lack of an actual name, first made headlines from December 1968 to October 1969, murdering at least 5 known victims in the San Francisco Bay Area. His other hunting regions included Vallejo, Benicia, Napa County, and the city and county of San Francisco proper. One of the first killings attributed to him was that of a high school couple, David Arthur Faraday and Lou Jensen, on December 20th, 1968. In 1974, he had allegedly claimed the lives of a total of 37 people, which included 3 couples and a cab driver. We're not going to get into the gory details of his modus operandi. We can infer from reports and sources is that this man shot his victims to death. Now, how were the police going to learn about this unidentified murderer's spree? Here's the catch. The Zodiac Killer wasn't just known for the homicides, he was known for messing with police forces more than anything. He literally made them dance on his fingers by sending baffling cryptographic letters to newspaper distributors like the San Francisco Chronicle, Vallejo Times, and San Francisco Examiner. 3 letters were almost identical, beginning with I, the killer of, and they were full of misspellings. It was in these correspondences that the man coined his pseudonym, threatened to keep on killing and even bombing if they weren't printed in the newspapers. The mysterious letters included 4 cryptograms and ciphers, which combined to form something like Z408. Both the FBI and CIA racked their brains to crack the code. 2 of them still remained undeciphered. The letters continued until 1974, but he was never caught. Some believe the homicides were astrological or biblical, since he mentioned that he was collecting victims to serve him in the afterlife. In 2024, a TikTok user, Jay Foy, claimed that the Zodiac Killer was his maternal grandfather, Richard Hoffman. Foy stated that the resemblance between the composite sketches and his grandpa had an uncanny resemblance, and wait for it, Hoffman was a police officer in Vallejo. If this is true, it could explain how he escaped the system's eyes. What's even more scary here is that the man had a family.
Thank you.
The Axeman of New Orleans, early 1900s. From May 1918 to October 1919, a bewildering series of murders took place. An unrecognized killer was apparently a fan of jazz music. As the murderer's epithet suggests, the victims were killed with an axe, which often belonged to them. It's been theorized that the target's back door panel was removed by a chisel, which was left neatly on the floor. The intruder probably got inside this way and attacked the resident with a sharp object like an axe or razor. There was no evidence of robbery per se. The perpetrator never took anything from these homes, which brings us to the question, why? There are a couple of takes on why the axemen slayed whole families in cold blood in their beds. The first identified pattern was that the majority of his casualties were Italian or Italian-American, which could give us a racial motive for the murders. Media sensationalized this speculation by linking mafia and gangs, though there was no concrete proof to validate this. Father-son duo of criminologists, Wilson and his son Damon, believed that the Axeman's murders were sexually motivated, and he slayed males only when they resisted the killer's attempt on the women. Amongst the speculation about this killer, one fact topped the list for how bizarre it was. New Orleans' dreaded Axeman was supposedly hunting down people to promote jazz music. We know that's weird as hell, but he wrote a letter to the Times-Picayune on the 16th of March, 1919, where he claimed himself to be a spirit of a fallen demon, notes stating that he would spare anyone jazz or plays the music. That night, all the dance halls in the city were filled with amateur and professional bands playing jazz, and guess what? No murders were reported that night. Quite the way Louis Armstrong wanted to spread his music, but the prime suspect for these crimes was Frank Doc Mumfree, at least if we're to believe the scholar Richard Warner. Frank used the alias of Leon Joseph Mumfree, owned a Mumfree's Garden District jazz business, which was struggling. However, he was soon making profits when the city was threatened by an unknown killer at large to hire jazz bands and play the records. The Highway of Tears Killer, British Columbia, 1969 to present. Ever since the 1960 450-mile-long highway connecting Prince Rupert on the Pacific coast near Alaska, Prince George in Canada, has existed. Roughly 50 women and some men have vanished on this passage. The story begins in 1969. The body of a 26-year-old mother of two, Gloria Moody, was found by hunters. Beaten death has remained unsolved almost 50 years now. It's said that in 1998, a local police officer informed the family members that 3 suspects had been found, but by then, they were all dead. Crimes showed a pattern of violence against young Indigenous women. No community in the region was spared. From 1969 to 2006, 18 women were on the police's search list, including homicides and disappearances. No link was established between the cases. Investigation remains open to this day. Most of these women were traveling or hitchhiking when they went missing. Many families stated that they were the first to organize a search party, highlighted a deep sense of mistrust between the law enforcement system and Aboriginal groups. Royal Canadian Mounted Police made a statement that a special unit, EPANA, was set up in 2005 to deal with the cases. New homicides aren't handled by this particular sector. Police found enough similarities between these women, including possible sexual assaults, links them to the Highway of Tears. For decades, a person has been arrested. Out of these 18 disappearances, only one murder has been solved, known as the McMillan case, and this gave them a suspect. Bobby Jack Fowler of Oregon. Fowler, who worked as a roofer in 1974, was believed to be behind these kidnappings and murders but was never charged. He died in prison in 2006, but the killings haven't stopped. That feeling of "I might be next" is always in the minds of First Nations women living in Canada, especially those who ride on that highway, because the last killing happened in October 2023. The government has tried to improve safety around this area, yet between 2019 and 2023, 7 more First Nations women have gone missing, the last of which was Chelsea Amanda Kwa. The attacker has yet to be caught. The West Mesa Bone Collector, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 2009. Back in 2009, when Christine Ross went out for her morning walk with her dog in Albuquerque, New Mexico, stumbling across human remains was the last thing she expected. Christine found a human bone on the elevated landmass of West Mesa, reported it to the police as soon as possible. Well, we're guessing she probably went into shock first, but that phone call not long after. The authorities then found the skeletons of 11 women, 1 pregnant among them. All fell under the age group of 15 to 32. Most of them were later discovered to be Hispanic, involved in drugs and prostitution. All the victims were from the state itself, except for the African-American teenager, Selania Edwards, who was assumed to be a runaway from Lawton, Oklahoma. So, who were these victims and how did they end up with such a horrifying fate? To understand this, we have to rewind to the early 2000s, between roughly 2001 and 2005, when several of these women went missing. Many were reported, and the sheriff's deputies did launch an investigation, but soon detectives handed it over to the cold case unit in the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office. Len Salazar, Toria Chavez, and Selania Edwards were all reported missing in their respective regions. Initially, the investigators didn't think that deep about a common structure linking these victims. 12 years could be booked for sure. The area where these bodies were discovered used to be a barren land before housing began there in 2006. In 2009, it was confirmed to be an incident of serial killings and was thought to be related to sex trafficking rings. Anonymous tip to the FBI and APD suggested these murders were committed by someone from El Salvador. The police suspected trafficking operations in neighboring Texas that targeted sex workers during events like the New Mexico Fair throughout the Southwest, Southern, and Western United States. Interestingly, a section of this human smuggling ring did operate in El Paso, apart from Denver, Killeen, and Las Vegas. People often connected the killings to the Zorro Ranch, owned by a known human trafficker of the time, Epstein, considering the site of the murders were in close proximity to the ranch. However, no official reports confirm Epstein's involvement. Several others were suspected by police, including a local press, Lorenzo Montoya, who had been arrested twice for violence against prostitutes and for threatening to kill and bury his girlfriend. Dirt trails from his trailer park to the murder site made him a potential offender. However, he was shot in 2006 by the boyfriend of a teenage sex worker, Sharika Hills, who was strangled to death by Montoya. Frederick Williams, the shooter, claimed that Montoya was putting the body of Sharika into the car trunk when he killed the brute. Police then searched his home and found videos of Montoya having intercourse with an unidentified, possibly dead woman. Footage faded into a wall. Noises like tearing duct tape from a roll and opening a garbage disposal bag can be heard, indicating Montoya was preparing to get rid of the body. Other suspects include a pimp named Fred Reynolds and a photographer from Missouri named Ron Aaron. No one has been confirmed to be the bone collector killer, as he's known. Though the pendulum swayed a lot towards Montoya, police couldn't verify this since DNA could not be tested unless someone was in jail. A bill by State Representative Yanira Garola plans to allow police to check DNA from deceased suspects. The bill has been unanimously passed. Long last, we might learn if Montoya the man. The Colonial Parkway Killer, Virginia, 1980s. The parkway connecting the 3 points of Virginia's historic triangle, Jamestown, Williams, York, has always been appreciated for its scenic beauty. However, a couple of years between 1986 and 89, the park became a sight of real horror. Since there were long stretches on the parkway without many streetlights, a lot of young lovers. Suddenly, lovers started falling victim to a serial, both partners sitting inside the vehicle. There have been reports of at least 10 people dying. For confirmed cases, masked slasher soon came to be known as the Colonial Parkway Killer. Methods of murder are often varied from strangulation to stabbing and even gunshots. The killer would then supposedly drive the victims' cars away from the murder site. First known victims in the Colonial Parkway murders were a couple, Kathleen Marion Thomas and Rebecca Ann Dowski, missing on October 9, 1986. Their Honda Civic was found a couple of days later at the bottom of an embankment. Autopsy findings showed that both women had rope burns on their wrists and necks, and their throats were slit so deeply that it almost decapitated them. The bodies were covered in diesel fuel, but the killer didn't set them on. There were neither any signs of sexual assault or theft. All the prints found from the car were taken into account, matched with no one in the police records. Following years, various other bodies were discovered, but the killer could not be arrested. Other known victims include David Lee Noble, Robin Margaret Edwards, Brian Pett, Cassandra Haley, Keith Call, Teresa Lynn Howe. There were multiple suggestions about who the perpetrator might be. Apparently, FBI agent privately mentioned to Thomas's family that the killer might be someone from law enforcement or some kind of an authority figure. Larry McCann and Irvin Well, working Virginia State Police's Behavioral Science Unit and FBI respectively, also speculated that these murders could not be done by a single person, and it was probably two people working together. In 1988, media came up with yet more speculation that the murderer might be Ronald Little, who was under arrest on immigration charges. The FBI flatly said that he wasn't a suspect. Coming to the next one, turned out to be little more than just rumors. A local fisherman was believed to be behind the murders, keeping the first one in mind. Maybe the fuel used on the body was bought for use in boats. Moreover, the car that was found on the banks of the James River, the sharpness of the knife pointed towards the involvement of a fisherman. A suspect, Alan Wade Wilmer, who was actually a fisherman, was identified. There were instances of him confronting couples on the parkway. His DNA could not be entered into the U.S.'s national DNA database despite public protest, clearing the FBI polygraph test. Thus, Wilmer could never be put behind bars. January 2024, authorities confirmed that Wilmer was the man behind at least two of those murders, including that of David L. Nobling, Robin M. Edwards, who was long dead by then. Wilmer sneakily slipped through the hands of the police and took his secrets to the grave. The Phantom of Heilbronn, Europe, 1990s to 2000s. This one will make you question the validity of DNA evidence used in convicting someone as guilty. The Phantom of Heilbronn was initially a hypothesized woman serial murderer whose crimes spanned from 1993 to 2009. The existence of this phantom of a woman was concluded from DNA evidence collected from multiple crime scenes in France, Austria, and Germany. Among these, the murder of a policeman, Officer Michel Kieswetter, was the most prominent, which took place in Heilbronn, Germany on April 25, 2007. The DNA showed the presence of a single woman at about 40 crime sites, which ranged from burglary to homicides. You might be wondering that if they had the DNA, what was stopping the police from finding this shadow woman? Well, back then, DNA analysis was pretty much limited. All the detectives could find were characteristics found commonly among Eastern European people and in neighboring Russia, and only the sex of the offender could be gathered, hence the moniker, woman without a face. However, in 2009, when the forensic system had improved considerably, it was concluded that the woman was never really a killer queen. According to some reports, the DNA matched with a burnt corpse found in France, which is known to belong to a male asylum seeker who disappeared in 2002. So, how did a woman's DNA turn up on a dead male body? Well, as it turns out, the previous lab results during investigations were discrepant because the cotton swabs used for collecting DNA were contaminated even after passing through the basic sterilization process. It was a real blow to the law enforcement system and threw light on the faulty practices. In this case, all the sampling buds were brought in from one Eastern European factory which hired women employees, and that's probably how one woman's DNA kept turning up at all these crime scenes. Maybe a worker accidentally left traces of her DNA, like skin particles or sweat, while handling the packages. This would explain why no such phantom killer's DNA was found by the Bavarian police, because they used swabs made in a different warehouse. The actual killer was never identified, and the police realized they had plucked a whole bouquet of oopsie-daisies. The Monster of Florence, Italy, 1968 to 85. The beautiful land of La Dolce Vita was plagued by an unknown assailant who murdered about 16 victims, usually the hormone-driven youth in wooded, secluded areas in the countryside around Florence. The Italian media soon coined this person as the Monster of Florence, who for some reason behaved like a werewolf and set out to hunt particularly during new moons. I mean, seriously. What do these butchers have against young couples? Serial murder is not a way to healthy sex education. Multiple murder weapons were identified, including a .22 caliber handgun and a knife. In fact, in most of these cases, the skin around the genitals of the female victims was found to be removed. The police confirmed that the slayer got 16 victims, and by the 1980s, couples were avoiding venturing into any remote areas. Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci were assumed to be the first targets. Among the others, there was Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini, Giovanni Foggi, and Carmela Denuccio. By the early 1990s, an investigation was launched by the Florence prosecutor's office, and several people were convicted, but the exact chronology of the murders and the main perpetrator's identity and motives are still unresolved. The Monster of Florence, or the Maniac of Couples, witnessed years of courtroom drama. This was the first known instance of serial murders against couples, and it drew a lot of press attention, as well as influenced lifestyles and raised concerns about providing intimacy to young couples at home more freely. A suspect, Pietro Pacciani, was convicted in 1994 for his past as a criminal for rape and domestic abuse. 2 years later, he was acquitted on appeal since the only proper evidence was an unfired bullet found in his garden, which matched the killer's gun, but was later revealed to be planted evidence. Pacciani died before retrial ever began. In 2000, authorities started looking into Mario Vanni, Giancarlo Lodi, and Giovanni Faggi as Pacciani's accomplices, who were colloquially known as the Snack Buddies. Lodi eventually confessed that he saw Pacciani and Vanni committing the murder in 1985, and after endless grilling, he started incriminating himself. Consequently, both he and Vanni were convicted in 1998, but Faggi was free to go on appeal. However, their sentences were mostly based on mismatching testimonies, and without any persistent motive or solid tangible evidence, it wasn't too hard to believe that the police were desperate to put an end to the chaos, and thus, the Monster of Florence murders are still believed to be unsolved. Theories floated around, with some saying it was done by a satanic cult, while others tried to establish a connection between the Monster of Florence and the Zodiac killer. Yet, the answers are shrouded in mystery. The only silver lining was when it became a hot topic for books, films, and even songs.
On black women and girls right now.
As more women are murdered.
The Chicago Strangler, 2001 to 2018. Between 2001 to 2018, a list of 51 unresolved murders in Chicago, all women and all choked to death, were compiled by the Murder Accountability Project through FBI data and various news sources. These cases have been attributed to a theorized serial killer or killers known as the Chicago Strangler, but the police never really found anyone. Online discussion states that most of the women belonged to marginalized communities or were people of color. Some were also linked to narcotics and solicitation, but despite the rising body count and the wild media coverage, nothing seemed to answer who the offender was. People often claim that the investigations were lackadaisical due to racial bias and corruption in the police departments, but the fact is, we're still far from the truth. A 2021 docuseries titled The Hunt for the Chicago Strangler has tried to show the systemic racism around black victims that's largely prevalent even today. The Servant Girl Annihilator. Late 1800s. Talk about cold cases, we're going to have to go back in time for this one. In the late 19th century, around 1884 to 85, an unidentified American serial killer made lives miserable for women in Austin, Texas. In December 1885, the New York Times had nothing close to reports about Christmas celebrations. Rather, it talked about a madman who was hell-bent on killing women. The killer was termed as the Servant Girl Annihilator by O. Henry, or the Midnight Assassin, who started operating 3 years prior to Jack the Ripper. In fact, the writer of the complete history of Jack the Ripper, Philip Sugden, claimed that this unknown murder and Jack the Ripper might have been the same person. Texas Monthly has stated that this Texas killer murdered at least 7 women, 5 black and 2 white, as well as 1 black man. Moreover, the assailant even brutally injured 6 other women and 2 men. All the victims were attacked indoors, dragged outside, and then killed. They were all posed in a similar manner, and 6 of them had a sharp object inserted into their ears. This spree came to an end with the murder of the 2 white girls, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock. Eula's husband, James Phillips, was arrested on grounds of witness accounts that he was unfaithful and threatened to kill his wife a couple of times. He was found guilty of murdering his wife, but for some reason, the conviction was overturned. The police then looked into several American cowboys, and reportedly, over 400 men were arrested during the course of the investigation, but none of them were proven as the murderer. Some voodoo practitioners of the African American community believed the murderer had magical powers and could turn invisible, since no one ever heard a dog barking or the victims raising any kind of alarm. In 2015, a show titled History Detectives aired on PBS, and by combining methods of historical research and modern techniques like psychological and geographic profiling, they identified Nathan Elgin, a 19-year-old African American cook, as the prime suspect. The justifications were that Elgin worked nearby the murder locations and had a missing little toe, which matched with the footprint left by the killer. However, Elgin was long dead, shot by the police in 1886 when they caught him attempting to assault a girl with a knife. Probably, Nathan was the one behind all these crimes, or perhaps it was Jack the Ripper before he got famous for all the wrong reasons. However, there's still a chance that it was neither, and the killer went scot-free. Jack the Ripper. We saved the best for last. Jack the Ripper is the OG when it comes to this grim list. The man killed at least 5 victims back in 1888 in the impoverished district of Whitechapel, London, and also in Spitalfields. However, the exact number of casualties is still unknown. He was one of the earliest known serial murderers and started operating way before serial killers became a topic for discussion in pop culture. Over the years, he's been called the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron. Nothing is truly known about this person. Where and when was he born, what his motives were, everything is still the biggest mystery humanity has ever faced. The alias originated from a certain letter known as the Dear Boss letter. Someone claimed to be the killer in this note and sent it to the press. However, this has been dismissed largely as a hoax fabricated by the journalists to spice up the story. That's just an occupational hazard, we're afraid. What happened next, however, was nothing short of a horror movie scene. George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee received a package containing a preserved human kidney, presumably from one of the victims. The police did find about 11 dead bodies between 1888 and 1891, but couldn't conclusively pin it to the faceless serial killer. However, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Ann Nichols, Elizabeth Stride, and Mary Jane Kelly were the confirmed victims of Jack the Ripper, known as the Canonical Five. Mary Jane Kelly is believed to be the Ripper's last victim. However, the first incidents with Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram are not a part of the canon murders. Smith was robbed and sexually assaulted before being hit repeatedly in the face and having a blunt object inserted into her vagina. Tabram's body was discovered on a staircase landing in George Yard, Whitechapel. The woman had stab marks on every possible organ in the body, with additional knife wounds found on the breasts and lady parts. Experts found most of the corpses had deep slash wounds on the neck, followed by gruesome mutilation of the abdominal area and in the surroundings of sex organs. The unspeakable maiming of victims' faces and the removal of organs became the MO of Jack the Ripper. Apart from the alleged victims, commentators have linked the Ripper to multiple other attacks. The attacks typically involved women living in the slums of the East End of London, working in the sex trade. There are multiple notions as to who the Ripper might have been, since the killings took place mostly on weekends and public holidays and within a short distance of each other. People believed it to be the work of a locally employed man. Others believe the Ripper was a doctor who hailed from a noble family and often ventured into lower-class areas to carry out his crimes. This idea cropped up more out of a cultural mistrust towards physicians and the use of science and technology. 3 suspects have been named in the police diaries, but the evidence against them was at best circumstantial. However, throughout the years, there have been many people thought to be remotely connected to the crimes by coincidental documents. Big names like Prince Albert Victor, Walter Sickert, and even Lewis Carroll were considered for investigation. However, without any confirmed forensic proof or supporting historical accounts, the killer was never apprehended. DNA tests did their best to finger Walter Sickert and Aaron Kosminski as the murderer, but the reports seemed questionable and inconclusive according to modern testing standards. In the immediate aftermath of these events, the Ripper became a children's boogeyman, and his image was conceived by drawing from various supernatural tales like Frankenstein's organ harvest and Dracula's cloak. Whoever Jack the Ripper was is long gone by now, but his story became a legend and a work of fiction by several authors. Even today, the mystery behind these murders lingers, even though they were over a century ago. Marvelous verdict! Alright, that was one bloody ride. I guess I should apologize first because these stories are bound to make anyone's skin crawl. Endless murders, and just 12 people who walked away with blood on their hands to never face the light of justice. You know, we'll never understand what pleasure these sociopaths derive from killing innocent souls, but what's even more baffling is how they managed to pull such perfect crimes. That's the thing about masked monsters. They can be anyone and anywhere. So, the next time you walk alone or drive on a certain highway, be sure to keep your guard up. No matter how great law enforcement is, there's always a chance that someone is watching. These killers prove that no name or face was needed to establish a legacy of fear. Unfortunately, that's all we got for you today, so stay safe out there, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and have a marvelous day.